He almost walked past it. Most men would have. The Ferrari was buried between a crushed delivery truck and 3 dead tractors, covered in a torn canvas tarp so old the edges had gone gray. The junkyard around it rattled with loose sheet metal and dry California wind. Rust, heat, and forgetting, that was all Silas Crow's yard had ever advertised, and on a Tuesday morning in Bakersfield, that was all it seemed to offer. Steve McQueen had come for a Weber carburetor. He stopped halfway across the lot, one hand resting on the door of his pickup, boots sinking slightly into the dust, eyes narrowed beneath the hard white sun. Around him, the yard clinked and creaked with the sounds of abandoned metal chains knocking against a fence, sheet steel flexing in the heat. A dog barked somewhere in the back and went quiet. The shape beneath the tarp was wrong. Too low, too balanced, even buried under canvas and years of neglect. It carried the quiet posture of something built by men who believed metal could have a soul. The rear quarter panel caught the light at just the right angle to show a line that had no business being in any junkyard on the edge of Bakersfield. He took one step toward it. The shape beneath the canvas had a gravity to it. That was the only word for what he felt, not beauty. You couldn't call what was under that tarp beautiful, not in its current state, but gravity. The particular pull of something that has waited a long time to be seen by someone capable of understanding what they were seeing. He moved closer. The office door slammed open. "Don't touch that." The voice came hard across the yard. A tall, weathered man in his early 60s stood on the porch, narrow face, thick gray hair combed straight back, suspenders over an old work shirt, boots caked in red dust, hands that looked like they had been cut, burned, and broken more than once without ever seeing a doctor. The kind of man who had spent half his life taking things apart and the other half keeping secrets from falling out of them. Steve did not answer right away. He looked at the tarp, then at the man. "You Silas Crow?" The man's eyes tightened. "Depends who's asking." Steve pushed the pickup door shut with a soft click. "I'm looking for a Weber carburetor body. Maybe a linkage arm if you've got one that hasn't been ruined by somebody with a hammer." Silas came down the steps, each board testing his patience. "Parts are in shed 3. That car isn't part of anything." The wind moved the corner of the tarp, just a little, just enough. A flash of metal, a glimpse of faded red paint beneath 6 years of dust. Steve saw it. Silas saw him see it. "You hear me?" Silas said, crossing the yard faster than his age suggested he should. "I said, step away from it." Steve took his sunglasses off and hooked them into the neck of his shirt. He didn't argue. Didn't back off either. He looked around the junkyard instead. Sedans, with their hoods open like dead mouths. Trucks stacked bumper to bumper. Rusted fenders. A school bus missing both front wheels. Everything in that yard had been abandoned, broken, sold, or forgotten. Everything except the car under the tarp. That one had been guarded. "You keep a lot of things under canvas?" Steve asked. "No. Just that one?" "Just that one." Steve crouched near the rear wheel. The tire was flat, not low. Flat from years of sitting. The rim was dusty but not cheap. The body line was unmistakable now. Italian. Hand-shaped. Neglected but not dead. He stood slowly. "A Ferrari," he said. Silas's mouth hardened. "Not anymore. A car doesn't stop being what it is because somebody leaves it in the dirt. That one did." There was something in the way he said it. Not anger exactly. Not superstition either, though it wore the same coat. Something older than fear and heavier than dislike. The sound of a man who had carried a name for too long in the wrong direction. Steve walked around the front of the car without crossing too close. The tarp was pulled low over the hood, tied down on one side. Somebody had not just covered it from weather, somebody had covered it from eyes. The front grille showed damage bent inward, a scar that had never been cleaned or properly stripped, but the angle was wrong for a simple crash. He had driven fast cars and worked on wrecked ones and stood beside enough broken race machinery to know the difference between damage from impact and damage from something done afterward. "How long has it been here?" Steve asked. "Long enough. Years." "Long enough," Silas said again, and the repetition carried finality. Steve looked at him. "What's your price?" "There isn't one. Everything in a junkyard has a price." "Not everything." The two men stood in the dust. Steve had spent enough time around men at tracks, garages, studios, and back rooms to know the difference between a man protecting property and a man protecting memory. This was memory. The worst kind. The kind that still had blood in it. "What happened to it?" he asked. Silas looked at the ground beside the car as if he could still see where somebody had stood, years ago, in that very spot. "Nothing you need to know. That's usually the part I need to know." Silas turned away. "Your parts are in shed 3. He started walking. Steve stayed. The tarp lifted again at the front. That was when he saw it properly near the inner frame, beneath the dust and the impact damage, a clean absence where something had been removed. Not broken off in the crash. Removed. Carefully. Afterward. By someone who knew what they were looking for, and why it needed to disappear. Silas." The old man stopped. Steve's voice stayed quiet. "Who owned it?" A long silence. A chain on the fence knocked twice. Then Silas turned halfway and said a name like he was releasing something he had held in his mouth for 6 years. It belonged to Nathaniel Carrington. The name moved through the yard like a match struck in a closed room. Steve had never heard it before, but he watched Silas say it, watched the jaw work under the skin, the left hand curl and open once near his thigh, the eyes go somewhere behind Steve instead of at him. That told him enough. What was he? A mechanic. A good one? Silas didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, like it cost him, "Best I ever saw." That doesn't sound like a reason to leave his car rotting in a junkyard. Silas's eyes went cold again. It wasn't left. It was brought. By who? By men who wanted it gone. Shed 3 smelled like oil, rust, and old arguments. Steve moved through the shelves, picking up parts, examining them, setting them down. He was listening more than shopping now, and Silas knew it. The old man leaned against the doorframe until the weight of what he was carrying shifted, and something in him finally gave. He sat on a metal stool and began to talk. Nate Carrington had not been born with money or a name. He came from cotton fields and repair shops, the kind of places where men learned what things were made of because they couldn't afford to not know. First time Silas saw him, he was 17, standing under a Buick, arguing with a man twice his age about timing. Nate was right. That bothered everybody. He had the kind of mind that could hear a machine lie, an engine running smooth to any other man, and Nate would cock his head and say something's off in the second cylinder. Then he'd open it up, and there it would be. He fixed race cars, then improved them, then drove them, because he got tired of watching rich boys ruin good work. That was how he crossed paths with Victor Langford. Langford owned Langford European Imports in Los Angeles. Glass windows, walnut desks, men in suits who called engines investments. He sold Ferraris, Maseratis, and Jaguars to people who cared more about being seen than about driving. He was the kind of man who talked to mechanics like they were stains on his shoes. Nate didn't like him. But Nate had a wife and a small boy, and pride doesn't keep the lights on. So when Langford paid, Nate took the jobs, inspection, repairs, pre-race preparation. Private work Langford didn't want done in his own shop, which was the first thing about the arrangement worth questioning. 6 years ago, there was a race meet at a private track north of Bakersfield, not big enough for the Los Angeles papers, but big enough for rich men who liked to pretend they were drivers. A young driver named Peter Albright, too much money, too much nerve, not enough fear, but not a bad man, had been entered in the event. Nate had been preparing his Ferrari for weeks. Third lap. The front end went wrong coming out of the long bend. The car snapped hard, crossed loose dirt, hit the barrier. By the time they pulled Albright out, there was nothing anyone could do. And the report said Nate caused it, Steve said. Report said the front assembly had been altered. Said non-standard work compromised the steering. Said Nate made unauthorized modifications to a car he had no right to change. Said he was reckless, careless, ambitious beyond his skill. Had he done those things? No. The word came out immediately, the way a true thing does. Then quieter. No. Nate was careful. More careful than most. He'd test a bolt twice if he didn't like how it felt the first time. He wasn't reckless. He was the opposite of reckless. Then who wrote the report? Silas stared toward the yard. Insurance man. Harold Keene. He said the name like he'd said it 1,000 times to empty walls. After the crash, people needed somebody to hate. The Albright family wanted a name. Langford gave them Nate's. Keene put it in a report. The papers printed it. That was it. That fast? Truth walks. A clean lie rides in a Cadillac. Nate had not survived to defend himself. He wasn't driving and wasn't supposed to be near that turn, but he ran toward the crash before the fire crew reached it. got Albright halfway out. Then something went up: fuel, heat, bad luck, whatever word people reach for when they don't want to say that men were careless with other men's lives. Nate died trying to pull another man out of a burning car, and by morning they were calling him the reason the man was dead. Steve was quiet for a moment. Then Silas told him the part that changed the shape of everything. 2 nights before the crash, Nate had come to the yard. He was worried wouldn't say all of it, had that look men get when they know too much and haven't decided who they can trust. He asked Silas to keep something safe if things got complicated. He said, "If anything happens to me, don't let anyone strip the Ferrari. That Ferrari specifically. Not his tools, not his papers, the Ferrari." And when Silas asked what was in it, Nate said, "The part they'll need to make me look guilty." 3 days after the crash, men from Langford's shop brought the car to the yard, saying it was evidence, saying Langford would arrange disposal later. Then Keene wrote the report. And the piece Steve had seen near the inner frame of the front end had been removed after the impact, not before. The story wasn't just wrong, it had been arranged, carefully, by men who knew exactly what they were doing, and counted on a dead mechanic's silence to hold it together. Silas reached into his pocket before Steve could leave. He produced a folded piece of paper, oil-stained at one corner, creased from being handled many times. An address on Chester Avenue, Carrington Laundry. "She's there," Silas said. "Evelyn, Nate's wife, runs the place now." Steve looked at the paper. "You had this ready. For years." Silas looked away toward the office. "Kept telling myself one day I'd be man enough to go there and tell her I should have done more." Steve folded the address into his jacket. "When you go," Silas said as Steve turned for the door, "don't start with the car." Steve glanced back. "Start with Nate." Carrington Laundry sat on Chester Avenue between a closed shoe repair shop and a diner with a cracked blue awning, steam on the windows, a bell above the door that rang too loudly for a room that small. Inside, the air smelled of soap powder, hot cotton, damp wool, and old coins warmed by machines. Steve parked across the street and stayed in the pickup for a moment. A woman moved behind the steamed glass, folding white shirts at a wooden table near the front window. Precise and quiet, as if the simple act of making a sleeve lie flat required all the discipline she had left in the world. That had to be Evelyn Carrington. She was in her mid-30s, though exhaustion had tried to add years to her face, and dignity had refused to let it win. Brown hair pinned back, plain dress beneath a faded cardigan, a thin wedding band that caught the light when her hands moved. There were people who wore grief loudly. Evelyn Carrington wore it like a second skin, and had clearly decided some time ago that no one would see her in it as long as she kept moving. The bell rang when Steve pushed open the door. She looked up with the polite expression of a woman ready for any customer. Then recognition moved through her face. Not surprise. Concern. Famous men did not walk into small laundries on Chester Avenue unless they wanted something she had already spent 6 years giving away. He told her where he'd been. He was direct about it. When he said Silas Crow's yard, her hands stilled. When he said Ferrari, she picked up another shirt and began folding it too fast. "That car has nothing to do with me. It belonged to your husband. My husband is dead." "Yes." "And that car helped put him in the ground, or kept him from being completely buried," Steve said. "I'm not sure which yet." She looked up then, just for a second. And in that second, the controlled face cracked at one small seam, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to hope, which is the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could afford to feel. He told her what he'd seen. The damage, inconsistent with the official story. The part near the inner frame of the front end that had been removed after impact, not before. A month's worth of unanswered questions delivered quietly in 2 sentences. The shirt slipped from her hands. She was a woman who had spent 6 years learning not to flinch. She almost managed it. Steve gave her a moment. Then he asked if Nate had ever told her he was worried. She told him about the numbers on envelopes, chassis numbers, parts numbers, import dates, names she didn't know. Nate covering the paper with his hand whenever she asked what he was working through. The way he sat at the kitchen table after Owen was asleep, writing things down she wasn't allowed to see. She told him about the man who came to the house 2 days after the funeral, soft hands, didn't blink enough, well-dressed in a way that felt like a warning, who said if she wanted Owen to have any kind of decent future, she should stop making Nate look worse. He had looked through every room, kitchen, bedroom, garage, tool, chest. He left without taking anything, but had been looking for something specific. He asked about a key, she said. Steve went still. What kind of key? He didn't say, but Nate had worn one around his neck for a week before he died, on a dark cord, almost hidden under his work shirt. He never explained it. She moved to the photograph behind the counter, the one she kept turned away from the room, and turned it toward Steve, a younger Nate standing beside a small boy with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile. One hand on the boy's shoulder, the other holding a wrench. Around his neck, barely visible at the collar, a dark cord with something hanging from it. She turned it away again. That is what this does, she said. It makes people look at him like evidence. No, Steve said. It makes him look like a man who knew he was in trouble and was trying to build a way out. She moved back behind the counter. She told him about the red measuring case full of calipers and gauges and precision tools that Nate had guarded like other men guarded wallets. Men from Langford's shop had taken most of his tools the morning after the crash, under the pretense of inspecting anything connected to the contract. Most came back 3 days later. The red case never did. Then she told him about the night before the crash. Nate came home late, dirt on his knees, hands shaking, smiling because he thought the smile would make her less afraid. He sat with her in the kitchen after Owen was asleep and said, "There are 3 places in a car that men never check unless they built it, wrecked it, or feared it. If anything ever happened to him, if anyone ever accused him of something ugly, she should remember the driver's side floor." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Steve asked. She looked at him with a face so tired it had almost become calm. "I told Harold Keene." Steve's eyes sharpened. "He told me grief makes women attach meaning to nonsense. Then he put a pen in my hand and told me signing would help close the matter." A pause. "I had a dead husband, a frightened child, a funeral I couldn't pay for, reporters at the door, and men telling me Nate's name would only get worse if I fought. I signed what they said would keep Owen and me in this town with a roof. I don't apologize for it." "You don't need to." Owen was 9 when it happened. For a long time after, he slept with one of Nate's old work gloves under his pillow. Evelyn hadn't told him she knew. Then one day he came home from school and put it in the trash, and she took it out after he was asleep and kept it in a box in the back of the laundry ever since, because she couldn't bear to throw it away, and she couldn't bear to give it back to him and watch him throw it away in front of her. She told Steve that Owen had said once he wished his father had been a baker or a shopkeeper, something that didn't have anything to do with speed or engines or men with money who needed someone to carry the blame when the speed went wrong. That he had walked a mile out of his way for 2 years rather than pass Silas Crow's junkyard. That she had thought for a while that maybe a boy who hated engines was a boy who didn't have to carry what the engines carried. She had been wrong about that too. Before he could leave, Evelyn spoke from the doorway. "If you go back to that car and you find the truth, don't find it for me." Her eyes held his. "Find it for the boy who was told his father ran from the fire." Owen Carrington came into the laundry at 4:17 with dust on his shoes, a bruise-colored school book under one arm, and the expression of a boy who had decided, some years ago, that the world would not surprise him again. Steve had been watching from across the street for nearly an hour, 15 years old, tall for his age but narrow in the shoulders, as if his body had grown faster than his confidence had been allowed to. He went straight behind the counter, dropped his schoolbook on a chair, and without being asked, grabbed a basket of folded towels and started stacking them on a shelf. No wasted motion, no complaint. A boy making himself useful before anyone could accuse him of taking up space. When a customer pulled up outside in a tired Ford sedan, with a belt squealing loud enough to turn heads on the sidewalk, Owen stopped mid-stack. His eyes went to the hood. Not curious, he would have said that if asked. But he was listening past the obvious noise for the sound underneath it, the way his father had listened to engines from across a street. Steve crossed the road. He stood near the Ford without pretending to be there for any other reason. He said the belt was loose. Owen came outside and recognized him immediately, and the recognition turned cold fast. "You came about him," Owen said. "Not a question." Steve told him what he'd found: the Ferrari, the damage that didn't fit the report, the part removed after impact, not before. He was direct and brief, because Owen Carrington was not a boy who responded well to being managed. The boy's answer came hard and hot, and had been waiting years for somewhere to land. "My father was reckless. He got Peter Albright killed. I know what the report said. I know why nobody wanted his tools in their shop. I know why men crossed the street when they saw my mother coming. I know why kids at school asked if my father burned in hell or just in the car. His voice cracked once on the last sentence, but he held it. I believed what everybody believed because everybody believed it. So don't walk in here with an old car and try to tell me who he was. No, Steve said quietly. You know what they needed him to be. The boy stared. Men who get blamed after they die don't get to answer. But mechanics leave marks. They touch things a certain way. If they do bad work, the metal says so. If they do careful work, the metal says that too. I haven't heard the metal agree with the report. A silence. Owen looked at the Ford. He had already diagnosed the actual problem water pump bearing, not just the belt. He'd known it from 30 feet away, the way his father had known things from across the street. He said it reluctantly, then was angry at himself for saying it. Steve said, "Come to Silas Crow's yard tomorrow morning, not to believe anything, just to look." Owen said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll come." That night, through the laundry window, Steve watched the boy stand in front of the photograph behind the counter, the one Evelyn always kept turned away from the room. Owen stood there for a long time. Then he reached out, turned it toward himself, and looked at his father's face. Silas was already standing beside the Ferrari when Steve's pickup rolled into the junkyard the next morning. He had not uncovered it. Owen got out of the truck slowly. He'd said almost nothing on the drive. Now he stood 10 feet from the canvas with 6 years of whispers, schoolyard cruelty, and borrowed shame moving across his face in silence. "I thought maybe you should decide," Silas said. Owen walked toward the car. He stopped near the front fender. His hand rose once, then fell back. Then he gripped the edge of the canvas and pulled. The Ferrari emerged from shadow piece by piece. Faded red paint dulled almost brown by sun and years. A cracked headlamp. A bent grille carrying the marks of impact it had never been cleaned of. The windshield clouded. One side panel scored with long pale wounds through the paint down to metal. The tires flat and settled into the earth like the car had given up on moving and decided to stay. It was not beautiful in the way wealthy men use that word. Not polished. Not ready for a glass wall, or a magazine spread, or a Langford showroom. But even wounded, it had the bones of something extraordinary. Owen tried to hate it on sight. He failed, and that failure frightened him more than the car did. For a moment he just stood beside it, not touching it. The way you stand beside someone you have been told to hate and find, against your will, that the hatred doesn't quite fit. The car was smaller than he'd imagined. He had built it up in his mind over 6 years, a thing monstrous and enormous, filling the space between him and his father's name. The actual machine was compact, wounded, present. It smelled of rubber and old metal, and the particular dry emptiness of places that have been left alone too long. He walked around the front slowly. They crouched at the front end together, Steve walking Owen through what he had already seen. The bolt pattern around the missing component. The tool marks clean under layers of dirt. The scarring that said this part had been removed after everything bent, not before. A deliberate act by someone who knew what they were taking and why it needed to disappear. Owen's hands moved before he could stop them. Tracing the edge of the mounting bracket with his fingertip, shifting his angle, reading the metal the way he had learned to read it in a garage before the world told him that garage was something to be ashamed of. This bolt pattern is wrong. Quiet. Precise. The scarring is clean under the dirt. The part came off after the crash. If it had been missing before the impact, there would be wear. Different dirt. Stress marks. Something. This was removed after. He pulled his hand back. No. He stood too fast. No. Because if that's true, they saw it. They wrote the report anyway. Yes. I quit me. He turned away, both hands pressing against the sides of his head. The anger had nowhere clean to go. When he came back toward them, his voice was shaking, with a rage he was trying to keep controlled. My mother signed papers because of that report. We lost the garage first. Then the customers stopped coming. Boys at school asked if my father burned in hell, or just in the car. My mother told me not to fight them, so I stopped fighting them and started believing them. His voice cracked. Just enough. I believed them. I threw away his glove. Silas closed his eyes. Owen looked at the ground. He had this brown leather glove, split near the thumb. I kept it after the funeral. Then a boy at school said my father's hands killed Peter Albright, and I went home and threw the glove in the trash behind the laundry. A pause. My mother took it out of the trash. I saw her. She thought I didn't know. The junkyard was silent. Then Owen looked at the open driver's door, the driver's side floor. He said, "My mother said he told her to remember the driver's side floor. So why are we looking at the front?" Steve said, "The front proves the report is wrong." Owen was already moving. "And the floor might prove why." He tried the driver's door. It stuck. He lifted the handle, shifted his shoulder into the frame, adjusted the pressure downward instead of outward, and the door groaned open on 6 years of corrosion and silence. He crouched inside the doorframe and ran his fingers over the floor pan, along the seam, around the pedal base, around a patch where the metal felt slightly different. He pressed. Nothing. Pressed again along the edge, slower. A faint click. A small rectangular section of metal lifted a fraction of an inch. Owen looked at Steve. Steve handed him the screwdriver from the shed and said, "Easy." They worked the hidden panel open together. Inside, a compartment, no bigger than a man's hand. Empty. Owen stared at it. Disappointment hit first, then embarrassment, then anger, because anger was always faster and easier than grief. There. Nothing. Steve looked at the dust inside the compartment. No. But dust tells you something. The dust wasn't even. A rectangular shape, long and narrow, had kept it from settling uniformly along the bottom. Something had rested there for years. Gone now, but the impression remained. And the edges around the lip showed corrosion inconsistent with the rest recently opened, relative to the car's 6 years of undisturbed sleep. "Someone came in through the back gate," Owen said. He'd spotted it on the drive-in sagging hinge line he'd caught from the road. The chain was newer than the fence. The lock wasn't Silas's. The ground near the gate was packed harder than anywhere else. Someone had been using it. "They took what Nate hid," Owen said. "Yes, but they left the car, because they thought they had what they came for. They found the real prize beneath the passenger seat, in a narrow metal channel behind the rail, wrapped in blackened oilcloth and tied with wire, a flat packet hidden where no one would look, unless they understood how a car was actually built, and what the builders sometimes decided to keep to themselves. Inside, handwritten notes in Nate's compressed, efficient handwriting, a small brass key, a strip of metal stamped with numbers that didn't belong to this Ferrari, and near the bottom of the second page, almost hidden among the columns of figures, 3 words and a number. Locker. Union Station. 218. Owen held the key in his palm and looked at it a long time. There are moments when a person stops performing who they're supposed to be and becomes who they actually are. Owen didn't know it was happening. He thought he was just looking at an engine, just following the evidence, just doing what Steve had asked him to do. He wasn't. He was becoming his father's son again, in the original sense, before the crash and the report, and the schoolyard, and the glove in the trash. He was doing what Nate had done, crouching near a machine, reading it with his hands, trusting what his fingers found over what he'd been told. The missing component was gone. The clean scars along the mounting bracket were clear as a signature. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were removing and why. Not a crash, not an accident. A choice. If someone wanted this to look like Nate's fault, Owen said, more to himself than to anyone, they had to remove the proof it wasn't. They had to take the part that showed the substitution. "Yes," Steve said. Owen looked up. "Which means they had the car long enough to do that." 3 days, Steve said. "Langford's men brought it here 3 days after the crash." Owen looked at Silas. The old man's face said everything. I know. And I kept it under a tarp for 6 years because I didn't know what else to do with a truth I couldn't prove and couldn't let go." "You should have looked," Owen said. "Yes," Silas said. "You should have called someone." "I tried. Nobody wanted to know." Owen looked at the empty compartment in the floor, then at the scarred front end, then at the whole car. 6 years sitting under a torn tarp in a California junkyard, sun and heat and dust working at it every day, while above it the world said Nate Carrington was guilty, and let that be the end of it. "He knew they'd come for it," Owen said. "Yes, and he knew what they'd try to take." "Yes, and he built a trail anyway." Owen's voice shifted slightly. "He built a trail for someone to find later, even if he wasn't there to explain it." Steve said nothing. Sometimes a truth is better left to sit in the air for a moment, without commentary. Owen closed his fist around the brass key. "My father put something in a locker in Los Angeles," he said. "Looks that way. Then we go." They drove to Los Angeles before sunset. Martha Ellison came with them, the reporter who had printed the lie 6 years ago, who had agreed, with the particular intensity of a person trying to correct the worst thing they've ever done, to help print the correction. She sat in the back, copying every name from Nate's notes by fading light. 17 mentions of V. Langford, 5 of Keene, the chassis strip marked not Ferrari, the entry that said, PA car used as shield. Crash will bury the rest if they move fast. Wade Branson rode with them too. The former track operations supervisor at Ridge Valley had spent 6 years in a White House at the edge of town, keeping himself small, keeping his doors shut, carrying the particular hollowness of a man who watched a wrong thing happen and chose to go home. He was done choosing that. Or so he told himself on the drive down. Union Station stood under its high arches and old lights, beautiful in the way public buildings once were, when the act of traveling somewhere felt like it deserved a room with dignity. Steve entered first. Martha second. Owen last. Cap low, trying to look like any other boy passing through. He was too alert. Near the newsstand, Steve clocked a man in a gray hat, standing at the ticket counter without looking at any board. Not traveling. Waiting. Locker 218 was near the end of the west corridor. Owen walked to it and stood with a brass key in his hand. 6 years his father had put something in there. 6 years it had waited. He turned the key. The lock gave. Inside, a rectangular metal box in brown paper and twine. The moment Owen's hands cleared the locker, the gray hat man started moving. Martha pulled the box from Owen's arms and dropped it into her bag. Steve put himself between Owen and the approaching man and held him there with the particular stillness of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to communicate clearly, long enough for Martha to pull Owen through the crowd and out into the Los Angeles evening. They opened the metal box in a motel room east of the city. The box had its own lock, not the brass key, something else. Owen stared at it, then said aloud what he was working through. His father used dates for combinations, not birthdays, something significant to the matter at hand. They found the date scratched on the back of the chassis strip in pencil. The 14th of March, 1961. Peter Albright's first registered car import through Langford's dealership. 6 tumblers along the underside of the box, almost hidden beneath a sliding plate. Owen moved them one by one. The lock clicked. Inside was a flat notebook in Nate's handwriting, more organized, more complete, more dangerous than the loose notes. Import records, insurance claim references, altered car titles. Chassis identities moved between vehicles. Cars burned as total losses whose parts reappeared inside other imports months later. Keene's name beside claim numbers. Langford's name throughout. And one entry marked with a star circled twice, Langford using claim transfers to clean import papers. Keene will sign if Albright pressure holds. There were also 3 photographic negatives showing a warehouse interior, 2 cars side by side with one partly stripped, and a figure with Langford's posture and Langford's ring standing near a chassis. Owen turned a page and stopped. PA car used as shield. Crash will bury the rest if they move fast. Did my father know the crash was going to happen? Steve read the surrounding entries carefully. The language pointed toward a pre-existing insurance scheme, a damaged car being used to absorb and conceal evidence of altered import documents. Nate had written this before the fatal race. He was tracking a fraud already in progress. He suspected the Albright car was being used to paper over the trail. He didn't know a man would die. He just knew that someone was building a room around him that had no door. Langford's man came through the motel room door before they finished reading. They went out the window, all 4 of them, and ran through the alley behind the motel, with the notebook pressed against Owen's ribs, Steve holding off the gray hat man just long enough to count. They drove back to Bakersfield before dawn. Owen sat in the front with the notebook on his lap, the brass key in his fist, and the glove folded against his ribs, and for the first 20 miles he said nothing. Then he said, "My father was building a case." Steve said, "Yes." He found the fraud and he was trying to prove it before he brought it to anyone, because he knew no one would believe a mechanic's word against Langford. "Yes." So he gathered everything, hid copies, left trails, put the key in the locker, told Silas not to let them strip the car. Owen looked out the windshield at the flat dark valley. He thought he had time. Steve didn't answer. The crash took his time, Owen said, not bitterly. Just as fact. The way you describe something that happened to the weather. After another mile, Peter Albright didn't know what he was riding in, probably not all of it. He just noticed something wrong with one of his father's cars. Asked my father to look. And my father looked and found something bigger than either of them knew. A pause. And now they're both dead, and Langford has been running the story for 6 years. Steve said, "Until now." Owen turned the key over in his hand once, then put it in his pocket. "Until now," he said. Langford now knew the locker had been opened. Wade Branson confirmed what the notebook implied, standing in his kitchen with a dead cigarette pack in one hand, because sitting down felt dishonest. He told them about the night before the crash. Nate at Ridge Valley after hours, in the storage bays under a work lamp, comparing Peter Albright's race car to a Maserati Langford had brought in 3 days earlier. Papers on a crate, import documents, chassis numbers that matched in ways they shouldn't. Langford was moving identities between cars' wrecked imports, arriving under one name, insured under another, repaired with stolen parts from a third, sold to men who cared more about provenance than accuracy. Sometimes he'd declare a car a total loss on paper and quietly bring its parts back to life inside something else. Peter Albright had noticed something wrong with one of his father's Langford purchases and asked Nate to look quietly. Nate found the fraud. And suddenly the careful mechanic who had seen too much became infinitely more useful as a villain than as a witness. Wade had watched Langford confront Nate behind the storage bays, heard pieces, Nate saying, "You don't get to put this on Peter or me," Langford suggesting he think about his wife and boy. Nate saying he'd made copies. Langford laughing and saying copies don't matter if nobody believes the man holding them. Then Langford had seen Wade. He came over with a smile, asked about the fuel logs like nothing had happened, put a hand on Wade's shoulder, and said with perfect composure that men with steady jobs should not confuse accidents with opportunities. Wade went home. Owen looked at him across the kitchen table. "My father died the next day." "Yes." "You saw Langford threaten him and you went home." "Yes." No defense. No excuse. Just the word, standing where it had to stand. Quote, "The morning of the crash, Nate had inspected Peter Albright's car again after seeing Arthur Bell Langford's mechanic, the gray hat man from Union Station, crouched near the front end. Nate was angry but careful. He checked everything. When he stepped away, the car was sound." "You'd testify to that?" Steve asked. The word landed hard. Wade looked at Owen. "And then—" "Yes." Before they left, Wade came back from a rear room holding a cloth-wrapped bundle and handed it to Owen without a word. Owen unwrapped it. Brown leather. Split near the thumb. His father's glove. Owen stood completely still. When he found his voice, it was very quiet. "You had this for 4 years." "Yes." "Why didn't you give it back?" "Because I was ashamed to knock on your door." Owen looked at him. "You should have been." Wade said, "Yes." Then, nothing else. The boy closed his fingers around the glove. Careful. Like something alive might still be inside. They told Wade, "Keene comes to a diner off Route 99 every Thursday morning. Same booth, back wall, same time." A man who thought routine made him invisible. Steve watched through the truck window from across the lot, while Martha and Owen stayed low in the back. Wade slid into the booth across from Keene and placed Martha's photograph on the table, the one showing the missing front components still attached to the Ferrari at the crash site, taken before Langford moved the car. He told Keene what Evelyn had told Steve, that Nate told her to remember the driver's side floor, that she had passed that information to Keene, and that Keene had passed it on. Keene's coffee cup moved and came back without being lifted. Wade said the rest, and Keene's face went the color of old paper. The blue Plymouth in the lot opened. The gray hat man crossed toward the diner. Steve pulled the truck across the entrance. They stood in the open doorway of the morning, and the man said something smooth about blocking a public entrance, and Steve said he was just standing. Inside, Keene was pressing something into Wade's hand and moving for the back hallway. Martha had covered accidents and disasters and political failures and men who turned their worst moments into somebody else's problem. She had learned, over 20 years of doing this, that you could usually tell the difference between lying and truth not by what people said, but by what they did with their hands when they said it. Keene's hand had gone to his coffee cup and come back empty. That was the tell. the motion of a man who reached for comfort and remembered he didn't deserve any. He had kept the original photographs not because he planned to use them, but because cowards often preserve the evidence of the thing they most regret, as if proximity to the truth makes them feel less far from it. Martha ran in. Steve held the man against the truck, calmly, in full view of everyone on the sidewalk, long enough for Martha to pull Wade out. Wade came out holding a folded paper, his hand shaking, a copy of the original mechanical inspection before Langford had it revised. And below it, in Harold Keene's own precise handwriting, one sentence: Carrington was not responsible for the failure. Langford ordered the substitution after inspection. Owen read it standing in the parking lot with the morning sun on his face. He read it once. He read it again. He held it with both hands. This sentence, that had existed somewhere, and been kept from him for 6 years. This sentence that changed everything about what he had been told to be, and who he had spent his whole life since the funeral performing in its absence. He didn't do it, he said. Steve said, no, he didn't. For 6 years he had believed, or told himself he believed, exactly what kind of man his father was. He had built a whole life inside that belief: the anger, the distance from engines, the route that avoided Silas Crow's yard, the decision to stop asking questions because the answers were already in. He had put his father somewhere, and the somewhere was wrong, and 6 years of life had grown over it the way weeds grow over buried metal. The sentence in his hand unmade that construction completely. Not quickly, not cleanly, more the way an engine sounds when something loosens, that had been too tight, a shift in the noise, a change in the running, the machine finding a truer register than the forced one. Owen stood in the parking lot and let it happen. He had thrown away the glove. He had stood at his father's grave and said unkind things to the air. He had spent 6 years believing what was convenient for men who needed him to believe it. He was 15 years old, and none of that was his fault, and all of it had happened anyway. He folded the paper carefully along its original crease and put it inside his jacket, against his chest, next to the notebook and next to the glove. He pressed one hand flat there for a moment, then he looked toward the road north to Bakersfield. Owen looked at the glove in his other hand, then at the paper, then he pressed his lips together and nodded. Once, the way you nod when something you already knew somewhere beneath everything finally gets said out loud. They drove back toward Bakersfield. By noon the next day, Silas Crow's junkyard had more people in it than it had seen in 20 years. Mechanics came first, because mechanics hear about rare cars through some current in the air faster than newspapers, then reporters from Bakersfield and 2 from Los Angeles. Then county officials who pretended their presence was purely procedural. Then neighbors, shop owners, track men who hadn't said Nate Carrington's name aloud since the year it happened, men who had said it too easily, women who had watched Evelyn Carrington carry something for 6 years that no one had offered to help put down. The Ferrari sat in the center of the yard, uncovered. Not polished, not repaired, not dressed for wealthy eyes, exactly as it had been found, wounded, dusty, the scars visible, the front damage exposed. The passenger seat sat on the ground beside it like an exhibit in a trial whose verdict had already been given and needed overturning. Steve McQueen stood near the car with his sleeves rolled and his face unreadable. Silas stood at his left. Martha near the hood of a dead truck, with photographs and copies of Nate's notes tucked under one arm. Wade Branson at the office steps, hat in both hands. Owen beside his mother. Evelyn had walked through the junkyard that morning as if each step was a deliberate act of will. Owen had asked her to come. Just Owen. She wore the same faded cardigan, her chin lifted, one hand resting lightly on her son's arm, not holding him back, not pulling him close, just there. Present in a place where her husband's name had been used to build a lie, standing in it with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided she is done being moved by other people's convenience. The county clerk stood by his folding table, trying to preside over a lien sale, and sensing, with growing unease, that something else was happening entirely around him. Then the crowd went quiet. Victor Langford's polished black sedan rolled through the gate as if the junkyard should feel honored by its arrival. He stepped out slowly, removed his gloves one finger at a time, and surveyed the yard, first the Ferrari, then the crowd, then Steve. His smile arrived last, unhurried, polished, to a degree that made it feel like armor. "Silas," he said, with the warmth of a man who had charmed every room he'd ever entered, "You've outdone yourself. I expected a sale, not a carnival." Silas said, "I expected a buyer, not a thief." Langford's smile didn't crack. He moved his eyes to Evelyn and went soft with manufactured sympathy. "Mrs. Carrington, I regret you've been pulled back into painful business." "You helped make it painful," she said. Then his eyes moved to Owen. The smile stayed technically in place, but something behind it shifted. Sons make old lies look uglier. They make the men who told those lies look smaller. "Young man," Langford said, "I hope the people around you understand what they're doing." Owen looked at him without flinching. "They do now." Steve interrupted the county clerk before the procedural machinery could gain momentum. He asked which chassis number the lien was filed under. The clerk read it. Martha stepped forward with Nate's notes. That number appeared in Nathaniel Carrington's handwriting 6 years ago, marked "Not Ferrari." The crowd stirred. Langford laughed softly. "A mechanic's scribble is not evidence." "No," Steve said, "but it's a good place to start." Wade Branson stepped down from the office porch. Men who remembered him from Ridge Valley went quiet as he crossed the yard. He removed his hat, said his name, and then said the official report was false. Said he had watched Nate inspect the car that morning. Said the car was sound when Nate finished. Said he had seen Arthur Bell, Langford's mechanic, at the front assembly before the run. Langford's lawyer objected. Steve looked at him once, and the crowd's attention swung like a heavy door. Martha distributed photographs to reporters and the county clerk. She opened Nate's notebook and read aloud. Langford's name throughout. Keene will sign. If Albright pressure holds, PA. Car used as shield. Langford said, "Enough." Steve said, "No." Langford turned to the crowd and did what powerful men do. When the room shifts against them, he made himself the reasonable one. He spoke about business, about misunderstandings, about the tragedy of a crash being turned into theater by men who didn't understand the complexity of what had actually happened. He looked at Steve with open contempt and said that movie actors with a taste for drama should be careful about the damage they did to real people's lives. Owen stepped forward. "No," he said, "you tried to take the witness." The yard heard it. The witness. That was what the Ferrari had become. Not property, not a collectible, but a witness that had survived 6 years of silence, waiting for someone to finally listen. Then Harold Keene walked through the gate. Nobody had sent for him. Nobody knew he was coming. One of Langford's lawyers saw him first and said something sharp and low to Langford, and Langford turned, and for the first time all day, something real moved across his face, not performed concern, not social calculation, but actual surprise. Keene had clearly spent the night going back and forth across the border between cowardice and whatever comes after it. He looked like a man who had finally crossed, not triumphant, not relieved, just done with the other side. "I signed the second report," Keene said. The yard fell completely silent. There was an original mechanical inspection. It did not blame Nathaniel Carrington. It identified post-inspection substitution of a front steering component by personnel connected to Langford European imports. "I signed a revised report that replaced those findings with findings that blamed Carrington." Langford's lawyer stepped forward to stop him. Keene said he should have listened to that instruction 6 years ago. He handed Martha an envelope containing the original photographs and the first inspection report. He turned to Evelyn. "I am sorry, Mrs. Carrington." She looked at him a long time. "Sorry does not give him back." "No." "Then give him his name." "I will." Langford's control finally broke. Not loudly, but it broke. His voice lost its silk. He told the crowd they didn't understand what mechanics like Carrington did when they reached above their station, and even as he was saying it, the people around him were watching a man reveal himself in public, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then Arthur Bell made his mistake. Moving toward Langford's car, he dropped the red measuring case. It hit the dirt and opened calipers, gauges, worn labels in Nate Carrington's handwriting. Owen turned and went white. "My father's case." Steve crouched and picked it up. He carried it to Owen. The boy took it with both hands and stood there, unable to speak, holding his father's tools, the ones taken from his mother's garage, the morning after the funeral, by men who told a widow they wouldn't know tools from evidence. Keene pointed at Bell. He removed the substituted steering component from the Ferrari after the crash, on Langford's instruction. Bell looked at Langford for protection. Langford didn't look back. And Bell said it to the crowd, to the reporters, to the yard, and everyone in it. He told me to take the part. He said if it stayed in the car, the report wouldn't hold. Martha wrote without stopping. Silas had worked through the night with 2 mechanics he trusted. Not a restoration, nothing dishonest, nothing cosmetic. Fuel cleaned, lines checked, battery temporary, basic ignition patched. Just enough to let the car speak once, if it still had it in her. Owen stood at the driver's door. He looked at his mother. Evelyn nodded. Once, the smallest motion, that nearly undid him. He climbed in carefully. The crowd went quieter than it had been all day. People stopped talking to each other. They watched. Inside the Ferrari, Owen sat for a moment without doing anything. The interior smelled of old leather, cracked rubber, and 6 years of waiting. The seat was damaged. The dash was clouded with grime. The steering wheel worn to a shine at 10 and 2 from a driver's hands that were no longer there. Everything in the cabin was marked by time and by what had happened to the car, and by the weight of the story that had been told about it. Owen looked at the crowd around the car. He was not angry at them. He had been for years. Now he was just tired of the anger, the way you get tired of carrying something that was never yours to begin with. He put one hand on the steering wheel, just rested it there. The grip was warm from the afternoon sun. He put both hands on the wheel. He didn't think about the crowd. He didn't think about Langford watching from beside his polished sedan. He didn't think about the reporters, the deputies, the county clerk. He thought about a garage floor. He thought about a man crouched beside an engine, explaining without being asked what the sound meant and where it came from and why it mattered. He thought about the particular patience of a father who let his son hand him the wrong tool without irritation, who scraped burned toast and called it fine. His hands found the steering wheel, the grain of it, the weight, the particular way it sat in a driver's hands when the car beneath it was built for someone who knew what they were doing. Steve leaned through the window and said, "Don't force it, feel it." Then stepped back and gave the boy the whole car. Silas connected the battery lead. Owen looked through the dusty windshield at Steve. Steve nodded. The boy turned the key. The engine coughed. Once, twice, dead. A murmur through the crowd. Langford's expression registered a fraction of satisfaction. Silas shouted, "Again." Owen closed his eyes. Maybe he heard his father's voice telling him that was the other wrong thing, and then laughing about it. Maybe he remembered toast scraped with a knife and called fine if you eat it fast. Maybe he remembered sitting on the garage floor, handing his father the wrong tools and not minding because there was the whole point, and the moment after the crash had stolen that memory by poisoning everything before it. He opened his eyes. He turned the key again. The Ferrari coughed, caught, stumbled hard, and roared. Not clean, not smooth, not young. Nothing about it was restored or polished, or made presentable for the occasion. It sounded exactly like what it was, a wounded machine that had been left in the dirt for 6 years and was still, against everything, alive. The sound tore through the junkyard and bounced off dead trucks and rusted hoods. It shook the old canvas tarp lying on the ground. It rolled over the crowd like something pulled up from a grave and furious at the light. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands. Wade Branson lowered his head. Martha Ellison cried openly and kept writing anyway. Silas Crow turned away from the crowd and pretended dust had gotten into his eyes. Owen sat behind the wheel, both hands gripping it, his face doing something that had no name in the languages people used to describe how a boy learns his father was telling the truth. 6 years that name had been said like a warning. 6 years his mother had folded other people's shirts and worn her grief like a second skin and refused to let anyone see her flinch. 6 years Owen had thrown away the glove and lived inside the story other people had given him because there was nothing else available. The Ferrari engine ran rough, wounded, and alive. Owen shut it off after a few seconds. The silence that followed was larger than the sound. He climbed out slowly, then he walked to his mother. Evelyn reached for him. This time, he didn't stiffen against her. He let her hold him not like a child who needed protecting, but like a son who had finally come home from a place neither of them could name, that both of them had lived in for 6 years, that they were now, together, leaving. The crowd did not applaud. Applause would have been too cheap for what the moment had cost. Men removed hats. Women wiped their eyes. Mechanics looked at the ground. People who had repeated the lie for 6 years stood with the particular discomfort of hearing truth in public and being unable to claim they hadn't heard it. The county clerk suspended the lien transfer in a voice trying to sound official and mostly sounding relieved. Deputies detained Langford for questioning late, but present. Bell gave a full statement. Keene signed his confession in front of witnesses. Wade's testimony went into the record. Victor Langford, who had spent 30 years controlling every room he entered by controlling who spoke and who stayed quiet, stood in one where the doors belonged to everyone else. No clean sentence presented itself. No gentleman's mask fit the size of what had been exposed. He was seen, in daylight, by everyone who had mattered in Bakersfield, and that not yet law, not yet jail, but the pure fact of being seen was a punishment he had never prepared for. Before Steve left, Owen found him near the pickup. The boy held out the brass key, the one from Union Station, the one that had hung around his father's neck for a week before the crash, that had been hidden in a locker in Los Angeles for 6 years, that had waited for the right hands. Steve said, "That's yours." Owen shook his head. "I want you to keep it." Steve looked at the key in the boy's palm and didn't take it. "Your father hid it where a mechanic would look," Steve said. "You looked. It's yours. You made me look." "No," Steve said. "The car did." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he put the key in his own jacket pocket and kept it there. "What happens to the Ferrari?" he asked. Evelyn had joined them. They both looked at the car, battered and dirty, and no longer needing to hide what it had witnessed, its scars visible to anyone who wanted to look, carrying the marks of what had been done to it and survived. Owen said, "We fix it." Evelyn inhaled softly. Steve looked at the boy. "You sure?" "Not to race," Owen said. "To hear it right." Steve nodded once. "That's a good reason." He climbed into the pickup. Before he started it, he looked back at the junkyard one last time. Silas on the porch, smaller than he'd looked when he first shouted across the yard, but more awake than he'd looked in years. Martha, with her typed pages and her ink-stained fingers, already composing the headline that would undo the one she'd written 6 years ago. Wade near the fence, not forgiven, not close, but standing in the open for the first time instead of behind a locked gate, Keene with the deputies. Langford near his car, surrounded by men who no longer looked impressed, Evelyn beside her son. Owen beside the Ferrari with one hand resting on the fender, not afraid of it, not yet at peace with it, but finally not running from it. Steve raised 2 fingers off the wheel. Owen raised his hand in return. No speech, no ceremony, no moment made larger than it needed to be. Just enough. He started the engine. It caught on the first try. The pickup rolled out through the gate and onto the road toward Bakersfield, leaving behind the dust and the rusted rows and the car that had waited 6 years to say one true thing. Behind him, the Ferrari sat in the center of the yard. Scarred. Still. Engine quiet again, but no longer silent. For years, men had said nobody touched it because it was cursed, because a famous mechanic had died near it, because some machines absorbed the darkness of what happened to them and passed it on. They were wrong. They didn't touch it because powerful men were afraid of what it still knew. And now, finally, the whole town knew what it had been remembering. He thought about Nate Carrington not as a hero, not as a symbol, not as a corrected headline or a name on a revisited report. As a man who came home late with dirt on his knees and burned the toast and laughed about it. As a mechanic who could hear a machine lie from across a room. As a father who, knowing he was in trouble and running out of time, had spent what time he had left building a trail his son could follow. He had not known it would be his son who followed it. He had not known, probably, whether anyone would follow it at all. He had just built it anyway, carefully, the way he did everything. The way a good mechanic does anything, not for the credit, not for the audience, but because the work is the work and it deserves to be done right. Some men leave behind monuments, some leave money, some leave photographs and tools and questions their children spend years trying not to ask. Some leave a name that gets said like a warning until someone finally has the patience to say it right. Nathaniel Carrington left behind a Ferrari. Not restored, not perfect, not clean, but honest where men had lied. And sometimes, not often, not easily, and never without cost, that is enough to bring a name back from the dust. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't restore what was taken. It doesn't give a boy back the years he spent believing the wrong thing, or give a mother back the morning she spent alone. But it is something. It is the truth finally spoken in a place where it can be heard,